Thermal Island, trees throwing pollen, babies in parking lots, hijacking bugs, and the cat's meow. All of this and more in this week's podcast. I hope you packed your bags because we're going on an adventure. Hello, listeners, and welcome to Pack Your Bags podcast, where we dive headfirst into the meanderings of your host, Blythe's curiosity about life. Today's topic, critical ecology and biosocial development. Our guest is Dr. Anne Showalter. Hi there, Dr. Showalter, and welcome.
Hi, thank you.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your academic prowess?
So I am an ecologist. I was trained in aquatic ecology, specifically lake ecosystems. So there's different ecology if you do stream stuff or other things. And the type of research that I've been interested in is how organisms use nutrients and in their bodies and how that affects their relationships with other species. And so, like a predator, particularly predator-prey interaction. So a predator is going to go, find the prey and use those nutrients in their body to build themselves, make babies, etc. And they're also going to release some of those nutrients as waste back into the environment. And so I've been interested in those connections and the impacts of those things.
Okay. And what made you want to study and now teach ecology?
I grew up in southern Arizona, and we did a ton of camping and hiking and stuff as a kid. So I was always very outdoor focused. But I remember very specifically when I was about 7 years old that I was watching PBS, and they had this show full of kids cleaning up a stream. And like removing trash and restoring it. And I just remember thinking that was the coolest thing I'd ever seen, and I wanted to do that. And ever since then, I was one of those nerd kids that would, my best friend and I had a Save the Earth club, and I just always knew I wanted to do more environmental ecology kinds of things ever since then. So it's kind of just shaped at least the general direction of where I've gone.
That's super cool. Mm-hmm. I can't tell you how many times I've watched PBS with my kids and I decided I wanted to do a whole nother thing because of just how interesting it was. Okay, so ecology is the branch of biology that deals with relationships of organisms, correct me if I'm wrong, to one another and to their physical surroundings.
Right, exactly.
Thank you, New Oxford Dictionary, for saving me there. So you are a professor at Clayton State University, and you teach ecology.
Yes.
So that brings us to today's topic of critical ecology and biosocial development. The word critical just simply means careful judgment. Thank you, Merriam-Webster. Biosocial development is an approach which studies the biological and social background of human behavior. And that came from Psychology Dictionary. Let's just use all the sources. All right. Contemporary social sciences aim to be diverse and inclusive, but traces of the historical dominance of Western European and North American academic institutions persist in scientific practices. Give us your take on ecology and how biosocial development plays a role in it, or vice versa.
Well, in science in general has been dominated historically by men. And so that's absolutely been something that shaped the development of ecology. And it's often an outdoor thing, which, again, at least historically in a Western kind of context is less of the realm of women than it might be for men. And so I think that at least historically, that's kind of where a lot of the roots of where ecology research has really gotten going. But I know that, it's probably pretty equal at this point. And I know if that's pretty true of biology in general, that there's, at least in that aspect of it, I know that there's also been, there's a bunch of movements all across science there's a Black Birders or, these organizations for trying to get underrepresented groups into science or to build a community of them so they feel more comfortable doing these kinds of things. And so there's been a bunch of this movement in ecology too, because again, historically, it's been more of a privileged, white activity to go do camping and hiking and have that leisure time and feel safe in that environment. And so that's, that was important for me in getting interested in doing that kind of stuff. And so if you're not exposed to that, or you're in a, more, urban environment where that you don't see as much of that, especially in a lower income area, where there's less green spaces, then that could shape just who is even interested in pursuing those kinds of careers. So
that's actually, I think, what piqued my interest most about this topic, and why I wanted to dive a little deeper once I was introduced to the idea of it. Because I'm barely a biologist,
right,
and you are one. And even where I'm standing, I want good questions. I want it, across the board, everyone asking, so that we can just have all the knowledge, right? And accurate, right?
Well, and your background shapes how you think about the world, and so it shapes the kinds of questions you ask, and your approach to it, the assumptions you make. And so, diversity. There's so much research out there showing that diversity makes us come to find better solutions and come to a better understanding of things.
I love that. Have you had any personal experience or observation where you have seen the human effect on the ecosystem?
Yeah, I mean, I imagine everybody kind of has experienced that. Where I grew up, again, this was in Tucson, Arizona. These are cities out west that keep growing bigger because there's land for it. And the area where I grew up it was a, subdivision, but there was a wild desert space really close to our house, and we go out and play there all the time, and that's all developed now. So if nothing else, that has changed. And I don't know that I can say I remember this, because I don't know that I've lived there long enough, but the temperature between day and night has gotten much more reduced than it used to be. So deserts are typically fairly cool at night and then hot in the day. And so you have a big change in temperature across the day. But because concrete and other, man-made structures absorb and retain heat, they release that heat at night when it cools off, and it creates something called a heat island effect, where it makes that whole city hotter. Folks from Tucson, where I am, are not huge fans of people from Phoenix. That's kind of a little bit of a rivalry.
Okay.
And Phoenix is huge, and it's a noticeable temperature difference between those two cities. And part of that's probably because of the heat island. I think there might also be an elevation effect there too.
Okay. That's all very interesting to me. I had not heard of, obviously the development I can relate to even here.
Right.
In Fayette County, we've seen a lot of that, where growing up as a little kid, we would see just huge areas of trees. And just when you think that, they've developed enough and we've got enough, all of a sudden this whole other patch of trees is cut down and developed into something.
Right.
And, initially I can say that I'm like, no, don't take that away. Especially as a kid, I'm like, I could feel playing out there.
Right.
And then once it comes, specifically the avenue in Peachtree City, I remember, which I'm 35, but I'm starting to feel like I sound like I'm 65, where I'm like, 20 years ago.
I know.
Anyways, so 20 plus years ago, looking out there and knowing they were going to cut all those trees down and just being horrified. And then the avenue comes, and what do? I shop there because it's convenient, right? Oh, I was going to say the heat island that you mentioned is something that I had not heard of before, and how you said at night that is what is able to heat up the surrounding area. Right. Because it heated up during the day, so it's releasing that heat at night.
Right, exactly.
So normally it would be cold, or it is cold, but all of that, so then there's not the difference between, and that came from development.
Yeah, a lot of that's from concrete. You see that really common just at all cities, not just southwestern cities. But
that was something I had not even considered. I mean, there's so many things I think of, especially seeing, parking lots, like even here at the school. I'm like, oh, where'd all the earthworms go? Are you under here? Do you crawl this far? Or did we take all of this from you? And where it's nice not to get muddy feet when it's raining.
Right.
I feel bad.
Right. Well, and then as an aquatic ecologist, that the paved surfaces like that change the hydrology, so how the water flows through a watershed, and then ends up in a lake or a pond. And so there's an ology word for you. You can podcast. But it paved surfaces, right? Like the water's not sinking into the ground, and so you tend to get more extreme flooding and just like big storm events that will wash whatever's on the pavement into, whatever water body that drains into. Whereas if it had been forested land, which is what would have been here before, a lot of that water would have seeped into the soil, and it would have maybe eventually end up in that pond, but it would have taken a lot longer time to get there over, so it's not like this big peak of water. It's like a slower increase of water. I know. And there's filtering, of course, too, that the soil's doing. So
talking about that is all really interesting and something I hadn't considered, because I imagine all of these big-brained people planning cities and especially large paved areas, mm-hmm. let's figure out the water flow, right?
Right, yeah.
And you do see that where mm-hmm. you'll have a retention pond or whatever.
Right.
People smarter than me that have, made their careers of that know, exactly the science behind that. But my connection to knowing the water flow, or that somebody has that job is
right.
When I was running long distances, training for a marathon, I would run on this just 2-lane road
mm-hmm.
out in Fayetteville, in a more rural than Peachtree City,
mm-hmm.
City, especially that area. So I could run for, 13 miles straight and completely zone out. Just
right.
think about, making it that far.
Right.
And my ankles would hurt and my knees would hurt
mm-hmm.
Until I figured out why. And it's because, and I'm sure you're nodding your head, you already know, the gradient of the road
mm-hmm.
isn't enough for my eyes to see it,
okay.
but it is enough to hurt my joints
right.
over that amount of distance, right? So I guess I thought, they've thought of where all this water is going to go, mm-hmm. and it's fine. But you're saying, actually, this has had a slightly negative effect at the very least.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, there's actually a lot of movements now to revert some urbanized spaces back to more natural. They're never going to be
mm-hmm.
the same unless we really get rid of everything, right. Which isn't going to happen. But even in like New York City, there's been efforts to kind of almost re-expose underground rivers and things like that to the air, and then create more wetland type space where water can seep into the ground a little bit more and not just flow out and overwhelm the storm systems. Because sometimes the storm drain systems, they're designed for a certain amount, maybe they don't get updated regularly. I mean, it's like any infrastructure,
mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And when they get overwhelmed, well, then it can back up into sewers, and now you're getting problems that we more than we would want in there, or they're just draining, kind of untreated sewage water out just because of the volume of water. But anyway, there's lots of efforts that are out there to try to take what we know about how natural wetlands work in absorbing water and, filtering it and taking that into urban areas to try to help us manage our own environment. And then, of course, it creates a prettier space to look at than,
of course,
a concrete paved area.
And no better way to get someone to pay attention, or a big population to pay attention,
right.
than when they have their toilets back.
Right, exactly. Exactly.
Okay. As a biology major, I am learning that natural selection paves the way for mutations in the individual and evolution in the population over one or more generations.
I wouldn't say that natural selection paves the way for mutations. It's more like... I had
a feeling that I had that worded completely wrong. I'm so sorry, Dr. Sinvaran, if you are listening.
So it's more
Let's go again. Let's try this again.
Mutations in DNA is what we're talking about. That just happens Some of it's spontaneous, some of it's triggered by the copying process of a cell copying its DNA to divide. So those things just kind of naturally happen. They're inevitable, and they're the fodder for natural selection. So if those mutations lead to some kind of new phenotype, I'm sure you know that word from,
Yes.
from your biology class, then that could be, and if it happens to have an advantage, even if it's minor, or a disadvantage, or a lot of them do nothing, then those, if they're positive or negative, then that's something natural selection can act on. In other words, if it gives that individual an advantage, then that mutation can spread in the population because that individual will have more success, more offspring. If it's a negative one, then it could lead to fewer offspring or fewer contributions to the next generation. So that's really
deleterious. That second one you said is a deleterious mutation. Just, reviewing for the upcoming exam.
Exactly.
Didn't know I was going to say that word in this podcast. Yes. So, okay, that was way more beautifully
When you
stated.
have thought about it a lot and you get that expert knowledge, it's a lot easier to put that all together.
This will be funny one day when I make it all the way through my studies and I look back and I'm like, oh, Pat, you precious little child. Okay, so I bring that up to talk about allergies.
Okay.
This may be a stretch, but from what I've read, which is not much, I will admit, it seems that allergies are a mutation.
I think some of it can be, yes. Some of it is genetic.
So let me propose this thought exercise.
Okay.
Let's take the topic of choosing trees for commercial development.
Mm-hmm.
Tree fruit versus tree pollen. If I am charged with designing a beautiful landscape and functional backdrop, one of the more important things I might be interested in researching is what trees are messy, air quotes.
Right.
According to an LA Times article, more private and municipal plantings are using just male plants. What do you think about this?
I was actually looking this up this morning because I was like, oh, she's going to ask me this plant question. And I don't know a lot. So here's the things that I think about with this question is, well, first of all, not all plants, in fact, most plants have both male and female parts on the flower at the same time or on the same plant. So you don't have a male plant and then a female, you have one with its both. So that's most plant species are like that. The ones that are, it's called dioecious when they have separate male and female individuals. I looked it up because I was like, which ones of these are the allergy ones? I don't pay a ton of attention to tree allergies, so because I don't think I have those. But
I didn't for a long time,
right.
And more recently I've started to be like, what is this?
Right.
I can't think.
Right.
I have a stuffy nose. What's blooming?
Right, exactly. And it might not just be trees too. There's lots
Correct,
and lots,
yes.
Weeds and grasses and things like that they're more the issue. But when I looked at a quick list this morning, none of them jumped out at me as ones that were actually problems in terms of obvious tree allergens. And the ones that I can think of in particular that LA Times article might be talking about is ginkgos. So ginkgos, I know, are dioecious, and the female fruits are actually really stinky.
Really?
So they're very unattractive as a landscape because they smell bad. And nobody wants to walk in a landscape that stinks to us, right? So my understanding was at least, and that's a very commonly used landscape plant, and again they're using the males because they're not making that stinky fruit rather than the pollen aspect. And I've never heard of ginkgo being a pollen one that sets off people's allergies, but.
Okay.
But, again, I won't pretend to know all the plant tree species that
and
cause
ginkgo,
people.
Do you know the shape of the leaf? Is it almost like a clover?
Yeah,
or it's like a heart?
Yeah, heart-shaped leaves. Side fact, nerd biology fact here. Ginkgos are, so you've learned about phyla in class. Well, in plants, in all the phyla that they have there, ginkgo is the only surviving species for that whole entire phylum. So,
what?
Yeah, it's a really ancient type of plant. They're not related to flowering plants, other than being plants.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, so it's kind of this cool
I love that. I
love that. I thought that was cool when I learned that fact when I was a student. I was like, what?
Okay. Upon the discovery of the differences between male and female trees, the male trees do not make and therefore drop fruit. And fun addition, as we talk about the ginkgo tree, stinky fruits.
Right.
So when I was planning for this podcast, I was thinking about just the mess of fruit, not even thinking about the smell. But when I was in high school, there was another kind of tree. I don't know if it's a Bradford pear, but they're beautiful. Whatever it is, it's like a teardrop white bloom, but they smell like urine.
Yeah, those are the Bradford pears.
Okay, we had way too many of them.
They're
One would have been too many, but
species in a lot of areas. Yeah.
Well, then maybe that's also why they were cut down.
Right. I have no problem with that. They're beautiful. That's why people planted them. But they're actually causing problems in some areas.
I had no idea.
And you can kind of see, like in the spring, you can see where they've kind of naturalized, and you can see little babies, out in, abandoned lots and stuff like that. And that's because they're blooming, so it's noticeable then.
So is this weird to say about are they an aggressive species?
I wish I remembered more about it. I know when I was in Ohio for grad school, there was a big to-do about the Bradford pears, and they were really trying to eliminate them. So they must have found native or negative impacts of it on the native plant species, that it was worth going out and trying to eliminate them.
So many fun facts this morning. Okay, so you say that dioecious trees are predominantly what we are seeing.
No, it's the monoecious. So mono, like both species or both sexes on one individual. Yeah, it's a little confusing.
And dioecious, you brought that up because is that the one that is then able to be male or female?
Yeah.
Okay.
Just like in humans, right? You have separate sexes for a dioecious tree.
So, I'm gonna mutilate this word. Monoecious.
Like mono,
I missed a hump when I wrote it down, so it literally started with an N instead of an M. Okay, monoecious. So, does they produce less pollen?
That probably actually has more to do with who the pollinator is.
Okay.
So, pine trees are monoecious, but they're wind pollinated. And that's why pine trees make all tons of mess in the spring, because they are just dumping pollen, hoping the wind blows it to the female cones on another pine tree. But if you're like a lot of flowering plants where you're insect pollinated, you're basically hijacking a bug and saying, take my pollen directly to this other plant. And so you don't have to spew as much pollen into the environment, because you have a little animal that's going to carry it for you to, the other flower. And so it probably has more to do with who the pollinator, or what the pollination path is, than in terms of how much pollen is being produced, than whether they have male and female. Because not all plants self is what it's called, which means that the sperm from the same individual can pollinate that same individual's
that was going to be my question.
Some plants can do that, but not all of them. So,
okay. So when they're monoecious,
yeah, you got it.
I said it. Yeah. Okay. They have both sexes within one tree,
right?
But they spew, as you said, the pollen out into the air. Is that true for all monoecious, or that's how pine trees are specifically?
That's how pine trees are, and they're an example of a monoecious tree. But like the Bradford pear that you were talking about, that's also monoecious. It's in the rose family. And they would be pollinated more by bees, which are going to take, so there's not a need to dump a bunch of pollen into the wind. It's actually wasteful for them, because they have the little animals that can carry that pollen more specifically. But there are plenty of, grasses are usually wind pollinated, and they're monoecious. And we know grasses cause a lot of people's allergies. Yes. I know like goldenrod and some of the other like things that are blooming right now. I believe a lot of those are also more wind pollinated. So
it sounds like what we need to be focusing on still hasn't really made mainstream media of male versus female. It's more the mechanism in which they pollinate with or around.
Right.
In through.
That would be my guess. I mean, it's probably not all of it. I know, again, going back to where I grew up in Arizona, mesquite trees are really common, and they often set off people's allergies. And I don't know how much of it would be wind pollinated, but I do know that they do attract a bunch of insects. So I would guess that they're also pretty insect pollinated too. Mm-hmm. So it's probably not like a hard and fast rule, just like anything in biology. Mm-hmm. Right. There's always...
But this is a contributor along with thinking about the sex of a tree.
Right.
Is just how much, what their mechanism is, how much pollen they're throwing out there.
Right.
Okay. What are your thoughts on hunting? Are you for or against it? Does hunting prevent overpopulation? What do you think about hunting fees?
I think that, so I'll start this by saying that I am a vegetarian. I've been one since I was 12. Back then it was all about save the animals, although I wouldn't necessarily say the same thing now. But I am also, I have a lot of extended family up in rural Alberta. They do a lot of hunting there. And as an ecologist, I think there's a lot of good in hunting. So I really don't have, it's not something I think I could ever see myself doing. But I think that it can provide a lot of benefits to the environment. In particular, if I go back to my Ohio roots where there was white-tailed deer all over the place, we as humans, we've created a lot of habitat for deer. They love our kind of lawns and cleared areas. And we've also gotten rid of all their predators, the wolves and cougars and things like that naturally would have kept their populations in check. And so without predators, the deer populations grow and become a problem, and humans hunting can be a way to keep that in check. And it can actually be beneficial to the deer populations too, because I don't know, I'd rather have a deer get hunted and killed that way than starve to death, in the winter or face disease or something like that. And honestly, and the fees for hunting, because I think you asked a little bit about that, I mean, those can provide a lot of money for ecological and conservation efforts. I've read some stuff or heard some stories, especially in Africa. I mean, they talk a lot about those big game farms and the pictures of the rich, folks with the lion or whatever, and everybody gets upset on the internet. But, and maybe there may be some places like that where that's a problem, but there are other places where they actually, that money they can get from doing that can be used to conserve so much more land and create livelihoods for people who live there. Because having stretches of land that can support those animals, I mean, that's taking a resource away from people that frankly need a lot more resources, know, and it's not really fair for us to say you can't do that. But if we can incentivize it by saying there's a good in you preserving this habitat, because there are people who will pay for that, whether that's because they'll pay to hunt one of your lions or whatever, then I think that could kind of be almost a win-win for a lot of communities. So
right, and so, when you're dealing with hunting, or as it's called in the hunting world, tag licenses, I believe.
Yeah.
There's a full-time job out there for someone that wants to count the number of any one species.
Right.
Note if it's male, female, learn about its breeding times or habits, or and their job is to make sure that species is going to continue even if hunted. So then they set those tag numbers appropriately each season.
Right.
I actually learned that in preparation for this. And I was like, I've only been hunting twice. and I almost hate to even say that I have, and not for the reasons you think that I would. I have gone hunting, bow in hand, and not killed anything.
And I've heard wonderful stories about just that being in nature, and so I get it. Like
I definitely have the crossroad moment where I'm like, could I actually kill it if I saw it?
Yeah.
Not could I aim and hit it, because I definitely could do that. I just don't know if I could take something like a sweet animal from living, because they're so majestic and glorious in nature, no matter what it is.
Right.
You know, and then kill it. And then not only that, but then I have to own the fact that I killed it. And then I have to, like, if it's a bird, I have to pluck the feather. Anyways, so luckily, I've kind of seen both sides, I guess. I've not had to kill anything, but then I've been hunting.
Right.
Anyways, I digress. But, okay. So, in talking about trees, if we know that killing the predator can cause an unwanted increase in the population of the prey, does it make sense to consider that cutting trees down might have a similar unwanted effect?
On the prey animals? Like the deer populations being high? Or?
Yeah, you mentioned the white-tailed deer. What did you say specifically?
We've made habitat by clearing lands and creating these suburban areas that it's actually better deer habitat in a lot of ways. Like there's more food for them than because they eat people's landscape.
Oh, right. Face palm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, they do. Oh my goodness. If you've ever had a garden or even tried to plant flowers outside your house, anywhere around here,
right, you
definitely know that deer get plenty to eat.
So in ecology, we have two concepts that we use to talk about like a food chain or a food web like that. We have what we call top-down control, which is when the predators are exerting an impact on their prey, and therefore that is changing the plants that are available, right? Like if there's wolves and cougars around, there's going to be fewer deer. Fewer deer means there's more plants for that area. We call that top-down control, and that whole path is called a trophic cascade. Like trophic means like eating. It's like a neurobiology word for that. And then the cascade of it kind of like falling down the food chain. Whereas there's also, so that if we're focused on the deer population, they're controlled by top-down factors, but they're also controlled by bottom-up factors. So things that start with the food being available. You know, if there's more plants, then there's potentially more deer because they have more food. And so for the deer where we've gotten rid of their predators, they no longer have top-down control, and we've created more food, we've basically created more for them on both aspects of it. And so that means that the population can really increase. Okay. So I don't know if that's kind of where you were going.
Absolutely where I was going.
There's these two mechanisms
at
play.
Yes, and I just didn't know how to word it to get us talking about it in the way that, so thank you, you saved me. How many people do you know that have come close to or actually hit a deer with their car?
That is a good question. I mean, I don't know that I've ever really come close to hitting a deer. I've definitely had them like jump in front of the car, but not like so close that. But I know like some of my relatives up in rural Alberta in Canada, there it's more of an issue of moose, and hitting a moose is more of a problem. But yeah, and that's not a pretty sight. But I know what, it's not something I feel like I've ever really swapped a lot of stories. Really? But, I mean, I know it happens. You see the deer on the side of the road all the time, but
I feel like every time I get together with people, someone brings up a story, like a dramatic story about a deer. I don't know why my friend group is so different from you. Like, I don't know what's going on. I don't live that far from school, but anyways, although almost hitting a deer or hitting a deer may not cause a heart attack, many would dramatically describe the experience like it did.
Undoubtedly.
Or a moose. Right. More so, I'm sure. A heart attack happens when part of the heart muscle is deprived of oxygen for an extended period of time.
I I'm going to go with that's probably right. I like to tell people I sometimes say I'm a bug doctor to my awesome. Undergrad or the non-majors. I'm like, I'm not a people doctor.
I hope to be a people doctor one day. So hopefully when I look back on this podcast, I don't just roll my eyes in disbelief. So while the most common symptoms in both men and women, and I promise I have a point, and this all ties to what we've been talking about. Although the most common symptom in both men and women is chest pain, women are more likely to have symptoms such as shortness of breath, feeling or being sick, back or jaw pain, according to the NHS UK. Mm-hmm. Do you see any correlation between the biological differences of men and women? And obviously, you already stated you are a bug doctor now. And the differences in symptoms they experience for a heart attack. Or do you think this could be a biosocial developmental response?
It's undoubtedly, like, the symptoms would be triggered by, like, the thoughts that we have about our identity. Is that what you're trying to get at?
Yeah, okay. Exactly. So just to kind of build that out a little bit more, basically just meaning that maybe women are just more in tune with their bodies and men are less likely to share their concern.
I'm a man.
Because they have been shaped by culture to be strong and ignore discomfort.
And, you know, there might be something to that, but I've also heard a lot of, or read some articles suggesting that women, because they often take on more of the burden of, you know, maintaining a home and, you know, rearing children, often will ignore their own health concerns because of just like the time for that sort of thing. So I feel like it'd be hard to parse, you know, the social aspect of that. I would sooner guess that it's a biological, you know, the different experiences are more with the way our bodies are built, and rather than how we, you know, how in tune we are with them, or you know, whether we're suppressing anything. That would be my guess.
That's what I would guess too, but it was intriguing to think of it in terms of, well, is it how we've been cultured?
Right.
You know, that maybe both men and women have the same symptoms through and through,
right? But
they're just not noticing these other ones where women have been able to go ahead and identify it,
right?
Because it's okay for us to hurt or to need something,
right? Where
it's not as okay for a man to need something. I know that is different in different, you know,
right,
social circles or families, but you know, overall, I have a fun article about why cats meow. Do you mind if I share it with you? All right. Every day your cat walks into your office, looks at you indignantly, and utters a despondent meow. You may not speak cat, but her meaning is clear. You haven't fed me yet, you monster.
You haven't fed me yet, you monster!
Anyway. House cats are unique in the way they use their voices to communicate with their human companions. They rarely meow at one another. So what makes our feline friends so chatty with us? The answer has to do with domestication, experts told Blythe Science. Before cats took up residence with humans almost 10,000 years ago, they were loners, wrote John Bradshaw and Charlotte Cameron Beaumont in the book The Domestic Cat, which I want to read so bad, The Biology of Its Behavior. Because these ancestral cats rarely encounter other members of their own species, they didn't need to use their voices to communicate. Instead, these wild cats communicated through their sense of smell or by rubbing against or urinating on objects like trees. That way, cats didn't have to come face to face with other feisty felines in order to send a message. That's still largely the way cats communicate with one another, said John Wright, a psychologist studying animal behavior at Mercer University in Georgia. Whoop, whoop. Mm-hmm. Love Georgia, that's where we're at. Why use vocalization when it's so efficient to use the other senses, Wright told Life Science. But humans don't have nearly as fine-tuned a sense of smell as felines, and we're unlikely to appreciate a cat spraying urine all over a new sofa. So cats
very
communicate very unlikely. So cats communicate with their humans in the way that is most likely to get them what they want, by meowing. They're manipulative, Wright says, vocal communication becomes a tool. Many cats even develop a repertoire of meows to express different needs and feelings or elicit different responses. For example, your cat might trill at you in greeting, squeak a friendly request to go outside, or demand food with a loud meow. Meowing at humans is partially a learned behavior. All cats meow as kittens to get their mother's attention when they are hurt, cold, or when she accidentally sits on them.
Oh my God.
While house cats carry this behavior into adulthood, feral, domesticated cats without owners that live outdoors mostly outgrow it. One study published in the journal Behavior Processes found that feral cats were much more likely to growl or hiss than domesticated cats who had owners. When feral cats did meow, it was indiscriminate at humans, dolls, and dogs alike. House cats meowed much more often and only at humans, suggesting that they develop meowing as a language specifically for their owners. In other words, your cat meows at you because early on she learned that doing so got your attention. If you're curious what your cat has to say, it's possible to encourage communication, Wright says. If humans respond with words and attention to their cat's chirps and meows, they can create a back and forth, almost like a conversation. So this to me was a very interesting article, both because I love cats and because I think it is a very interesting and fun way to look at an example of biosocial development. I know that biosocial development is the study, in humans and people. However, I thought this would be a fun imagery, I guess, to kind of walk away with in what biosocial development kind of is, but in a cat, Would you say that I'm on the right track with that? Would you have kind of a, oh, well, you're close. Did you like the article? What are your thoughts, considering this in light of, the topic today?
I mean, I think everything that you read in that article is stuff that I knew about in terms of how cats vocalize and what's contributing to that. I feel like I'm a little weaker on like having a firm understanding of the biosocial development aspect of it. But if it's really just about how your environment shapes your behavior or how you're thinking, then it certainly seems like that's what's happening in these cats. I mean, this is a learned behavior that they're doing, is the meowing and the vocalizations.
Was it Piaget?
Hold up.
Okay, so Piaget, 1936, was one of the first psychologists to make a systematic study of cognitive development. He was the father of cognitive development. But what I meant to say here was Pavlov.
Oh, yes, Pavlov's dog with the salivating, with the bell ringing. Yeah.
And the bell ringing, yes. Right. I knew there was another component there. Okay. Dr. Showalter, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you for every ounce of what you put into this podcast. I'm so thankful in so many ways, and I'm so happy to have met you.
Yeah, well, it was great. I had a fun time.
This is where you'll come in and say, this is where I said another word, but I meant Pavlov. Back to conversation.
What if you bleep it out like a cuss word, and then we'll go back and be like, I couldn't actually say the wrong person here. Are you kidding me? This is for my psych class.